husband passed on a Tuesday in November, and by the following Monday I was already back at work. People thought that was strange. My daughter called me on the Sunday night before, voice tight with worry, and said, "Mum, you don't have to do this yet." But I did. Not because I was strong. Because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. His name had been Gerald. 38 years we were together. He liked his tea with 2 sugars and a splash of milk, and he always left the porch light on when I worked late. When he went, the porch light stopped mattering. The house stopped mattering. The only thing that kept me upright was having somewhere to be at 7 in the morning. I worked as a claims processor for a mid-size insurance company in downtown Ottawa. Not glamorous work. I spent my days reviewing disability and long-term care files, cross-checking documentation, flagging inconsistencies. Most people's eyes would glaze over if I described it at a dinner party, but I was good at it. I had been good at it for over 20 years. And in those first months after Gerald died, being good at something, anything, was the only anchor I had. I was 62 years old, and I took the OC Transpo bus home every evening, the number 85, leaving the office around 9 most nights because the work had piled up while I'd been away for the funeral, and I didn't trust anyone else to clear it properly. The bus stop was half a block from the office, and there was a Tim Hortons on the corner that stayed open until 10. That's where I met the man who would eventually save my life, though I didn't know that for a long time. His name was Desmond. He was the night security guard at the office building across the street from my Tim Hortons corner. A tall man, somewhere in his late 50s, with a greying beard, kept very neat, and the kind of stillness about him that comes from years of watching without being watched. He stood outside his lobby entrance most evenings when the weather permitted, drinking his own coffee from a thermos. I noticed him because he always nodded when I passed. That was it, just a nod. In a city where most people stare at their phones, that small acknowledgement caught me off guard the first time. The second time, I nodded back. By the third week, I had started bringing him a coffee from Tim Hortons, a large double-double, which I guessed at, and which turned out to be exactly right. He didn't have to do that, he said the first time I handed it to him through the cold October air. I was getting one anyway, I said, which was true. And that was how it started. Every weeknight on my way to the bus stop, I would pick up 2 large coffees. One for me, one for Desmond. We never talked for long, 5 minutes, sometimes 10 if the bus was running late. He told me he'd spent 17 years working in building security, that he had a daughter in Vancouver and a son he hadn't spoken to in 3 years for reasons he didn't elaborate on, and I didn't push. I told him about Gerald a little. He listened the way that quiet people listen, fully, without rushing to fill the silence afterward. It was a small thing, a cup of coffee. But in that winter, when the grief was so heavy, I sometimes had to sit in the bathroom at work just to breathe properly. Those 5 minutes on the corner with Desmond felt like the only human contact that didn't require me to perform being fine. Months passed. The winter turned into a long, reluctant Ottawa spring. I kept bringing the coffees. He kept being there. And then, one evening in late April, he wasn't. I stood at the corner with 2 cups and looked over at the building entrance. A different guard, younger, unfamiliar, stood inside the glass doors. I didn't think much of it. Shift changes happen. I took the bus home, drank both coffees myself, and went to bed. But the next night, Desmond wasn't there again. And the night after that. On the 4th night, I crossed the street and asked the younger guard if Desmond was all right. The young man looked at me carefully. "He's around," he said, which was not really an answer. "Are you a friend of his?" "I suppose I am," I said. He nodded slowly, then said, "He asked about you, actually. He asked me to let him know if the lady with the coffees came by." He glanced toward the interior of the lobby, then back at me. "He's going to be outside in about 10 minutes, if you want to wait." I waited. When Desmond came through the lobby doors, I could see immediately that something was wrong. He was moving carefully, the way people move, when something hurts that they don't want to admit hurts. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. "You didn't have to wait," he said. "I brought you a coffee," I said. "You've been gone 4 days and nobody told me anything." Something shifted in his expression. I don't know if it was the directness or just the fact of being noticed. He looked away for a moment toward the street. "I had some trouble," he said, "at home. It's complicated." I handed him the coffee. "You don't have to tell me." "No," he said. He took the cup, wrapped both hands around it. "I think maybe I do." He told me slowly over the next several evenings. His son, the one he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, had reached out, not to reconcile, to borrow money, a significant amount, he said, without specifying the number, tied to a business venture that didn't sound right to him. But his son had a way of making everything sound almost reasonable, almost legitimate, almost like it would work out. Desmond had said no. His son had escalated. There had been a confrontation at Desmond's apartment building. His son had shown up with someone Desmond didn't recognize, and the conversation had gone badly enough that Desmond had called the police. He was shaken by it, not afraid exactly. Desmond didn't seem like a man who frightened easily, but hollowed out in the way that family trouble hollows you out, because it's not like being afraid of a stranger. It's being afraid of someone who knows exactly where all your soft places are. "I keep thinking I should have handled it differently," he said one evening. "Earlier, years ago." "You can't fix something you didn't cause," I said. He looked at me. "You sound like you've told yourself that before." "Constantly," I said. "My daughter called me around that time to ask how I was doing, and I told her I was fine, which was almost true. She was living in Kingston with her husband and their 2 kids, and she worried about me being alone in the house. I told her I had friends at work. I didn't mention Desmond because I knew she would make it into something it wasn't, and I didn't have the energy to explain what it actually was, which was simply this: 2 older people, both a little battered by life, keeping each other company for 5 minutes a night over bad coffee in the cold. That was all it was, and then it became something else. It was a Thursday evening in May. I had stayed late to finish a review on a file that had been bothering me for several weeks. The file involved a long-term care claim for an elderly man in Nepean. I'll call him the claimant because his details aren't mine to share, and the more I reviewed it, the more certain I was that the supporting documentation had been altered. Not obviously, subtly. The kind of subtle that only catches your eye when you've been doing this work long enough to feel when something is slightly off, without being able to immediately say why. I printed 3 pages of notes, tucked them into my bag, and left the office around 9:30. The evening was cool. That particular smell of Ottawa in May, that is equal parts river and thawing mud, and someone nearby barbecuing for the first time since October. I walked the half-block to Tim Hortons, bought 2 coffees, and crossed the street to Desmond's corner. He was there, but the moment I reached him I knew something was wrong. He didn't take the coffee right away. He was watching something over my shoulder with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Sharper, more deliberate. "Don't turn around right away," he said quietly. I didn't. "There's a man," he said, "dark jacket standing at the corner of Spark Street. He's been there for about 40 minutes. He was outside your building when you left, and he's been following you since." My stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" "I've been watching him for 20 minutes to be sure," Desmond said. "I'm sure." I thought immediately and with a clarity that surprised me about the file in my bag, the altered documentation, the claimant in Nepean. I had flagged inconsistencies in that file 3 weeks ago and sent an internal memo to my supervisor. I had no idea what had happened to that memo, or who had seen it. "What do I do?" I said. "You don't go to your bus stop," Desmond said. "Not tonight. I'm going to call my shift supervisor, and then I'm going to call you a cab to the Marriott on Kent Street. You're going to sit in the lobby there until I tell you it's all right." Desmond. Please, he said. There was something in that word, not drama, not panic, just the plain urgency of someone who is taking a threat seriously and needs you to take it seriously too. I nodded. He made the call to his supervisor, then to a cab company. A proper cab, not a rideshare app, he specified. And while we waited, we stood and talked about nothing in particular, because he said it was better if the man across the street couldn't see that anything had changed. The cab came. I got in. As it pulled away, I looked through the rear window and saw Desmond still standing in his spot. Very still, watching the man in the dark jacket. I sat in the Marriott lobby for 2 hours with a cup of tea I barely tasted and my printed notes spread on the table in front of me, trying to look like someone waiting for a late check-in, rather than someone who was quietly having the worst evening she'd had since the November her husband died. At 11:15, my phone rang. Desmond. He's gone, he said. But I think you should call the police tonight. And your supervisor. And I think you should make copies of whatever is in that bag. How did you know there was something in the bag? I said. A pause. Because that's the only thing that makes sense, he said. Someone who follows a 62-year-old woman from an insurance office at 9:30 at night isn't following the woman. He's following what she's carrying. I sat with that for a moment. Desmond, I said, you've been doing this job a long time. 17 years, he said. You're very good at it, I said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Go make those copies. I called my daughter from the hotel lobby before I called anyone else. I don't entirely know why. Some instinct that had more to do with grief than fear. Some need to hear a voice that had known me a long time. She answered on the second ring, already alert the way young mothers are always alert in the middle of the night, primed for emergency. Mum? What's wrong? Nothing is wrong, I said, which was not entirely true. I just wanted to hear your voice. There was a pause. Mum. I'm all right, I said. I'll explain everything tomorrow. I wanted to tell you that you were right. I should have let people help me more this year. I've been very stubborn. Another pause. Then, are you sure you're okay? I'm in a hotel lobby in downtown Ottawa, I said. I have tea and I have a friend who is looking out for me. I am genuinely all right. She didn't fully believe me, I think, but she trusted me enough to let it go until morning. I called the non-emergency police line next, and they took a report and connected me to a detective who handled financial crimes, and told me to bring in my notes and the original file materials first thing in the morning. I called my supervisor's emergency line after that and left a detailed message. Then I sat in the Marriott lobby until midnight, when I finally took a cab home. The next several weeks were complicated in the way that doing the right thing is often complicated. There were statements to give, files to submit, internal reviews at my company. The insurance claim had been fraudulent, not the claimant's claim, but a scheme operating around it, involving a third-party medical assessor who had been falsifying documentation for 5 different files across 3 companies. The man who had followed me worked for a company connected to the assessor, and he had apparently been monitoring several employees who might have flagged the discrepancies. My supervisor apologized to me, which I appreciated. The internal memo I'd sent 3 weeks earlier had gotten buried in an administrative reorganization. Nobody had intended for that to happen, but it had, and in the meantime, whoever was behind the fraud had been watching to see if anyone was going to pull the thread further. I had pulled the thread. The police investigation took months. I won't describe all of it because most of it was tedious and procedural, and not particularly illuminating. What mattered was that the fraud was exposed, the assessor faced charges, and the claimant in Nepean, the elderly man whose file had started all of this, had his legitimate claim properly reinstated. Through all of it, every weeknight I brought Desmond his coffee. He never made a big thing of what he'd done. That was very much his way. When I tried to thank him properly, a few days after the hotel lobby evening, he just shook his head and said, He brought me coffee every night all winter when I was standing in the cold. Let's call it even." "It's not even," I said. "It is to me," he said. We stood quietly for a moment. The May evening had turned warm, the kind of Ottawa evening that makes you forget it was -34 months ago. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You can. Your son, have you heard anything more?" His expression shifted slightly. "He called last week. Not about money this time. He called because apparently his business partner, the one he brought to my building, has been arrested for something unrelated, and my son is sitting with that." He paused. "He didn't ask for anything, he just called." "That's something," I said. "It's something," he agreed. I thought about Gerald then, about the ways people stay connected even when the connection is frayed, about how grief and estrangement aren't really that different. Both of them leave you holding a shape of someone who isn't quite there anymore. I thought about my daughter calling at 11 at night and answering on the second ring, about how much I had underestimated, this past year, the value of being reached for. "I think you should call him back," I said. Desmond looked at the street. A bus passed, the number 85, and I watched it go without any urgency at all. "I think you might be right," he said. He did call. I know because he told me, about 2 weeks later, that he and his son had spoken for almost an hour, that nothing was resolved exactly, and that trust would take a long time to rebuild, but that the door was open now. He told me this on a Wednesday evening in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything, as if it hadn't cost him anything. But his hands, wrapped around the coffee cup, were steadier than I had seen them in months. My daughter came to visit in June with the kids. We sat on the back porch of the house that had felt too large and too quiet for the better part of a year, and she asked me what had changed, because she said I seemed different. "I had a very strange spring," I said. "Strange how?" "Strange good, mostly," I said. "I learned that being observant is a form of kindness, and that being kind is a form of being observant. I think they're the same thing, actually. I think I'd forgotten that." She looked at me for a moment in the way she does when she's deciding whether to ask a follow-up question. Then she reached over and put her hand over mine on the armrest. "I'm glad you're okay, Mum," she said. "So am I said. The porch light was on. I had started leaving it on again, not long after the hotel lobby night, not for any particular reason, just because it seemed right to have a light on when you're expecting to come home, just because some habits are worth keeping, the ones that say, someone here is paying attention, someone here is watching out. Desmond and I still have our coffees, most evenings. He's thinking about retiring next year, he says, and his daughter in Vancouver has been asking him to visit. He's never been to BC, which I find remarkable for someone who's been in this country his whole life. I told him the mountains will rearrange something in him. "You sound like you know," he said. "Gerald and I went once," I said, "on our 20th anniversary." I paused. He cried a little, looking at them, and then pretended he hadn't. Desmond smiled at that. It was the full version of his smile, the one he doesn't hand out casually. "Sounds like a man worth crying a little for," he said. "He was," I said. "He really was." Be kind, not because the world will reward you for it, or because it will always be noticed, or because it will come back to you in some tidy, proportional way. Be kind because it makes you someone who pays attention. And paying attention, truly, quietly, consistently paying attention to the people around you, is the closest thing to protection that most of us will ever be able to offer each other. That's what I've learned anyway, at 62 years old, drinking bad coffee on a street corner in Ottawa. It turns out to be enough. I've been thinking about that cup of coffee a lot lately. Not the one Desmond was holding when he told me to stop walking. The first one. The one I handed him on a cold October evening because I was getting one anyway, and it seemed wasteful not to. That was the moment everything that came after began, though I had no way of knowing it then. That's how it usually works, I think. The important things don't announce themselves. What I understand now, looking back on that year, is that kindness and attention are not separate things. When I started bringing Desmond his coffee, I wasn't doing it to build goodwill or to protect myself or to create anything lasting. I was doing it because Gerald had taught me, without ever saying so directly, that the people who are simply there, the ones who hold the door, who nod, who stand quietly in the cold doing their job, deserve to be acknowledged. That's a moral habit. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like virtue when you're doing it. It just feels like the decent way to move through the world. But that habit of decency built something I hadn't expected. It built trust. And trust, over time, made Desmond pay attention to me the way he paid attention to everything in his sightline. Carefully, seriously, without fuss. When he noticed the man in the dark jacket, he didn't hesitate. He acted because he knew who I was, because I had made myself knowable, one coffee at a time, over many months. That's the part I keep turning over. Being known is a form of safety. I had spent the year after Gerald died, making myself smaller, more self-sufficient, more private, as if needing less from the world was the same as being stronger. It isn't. Desmond's steadiness that evening came from 17 years of learning to read a situation clearly, to separate what he felt from what he saw, to act on evidence rather than instinct alone. That kind of clear-eyed, quiet intelligence, the kind that doesn't panic, that watches and waits until it's certain, is something I'd underestimated in people who work without recognition. And the thing about Desmond that I admire most, the thing I think about when I'm having a hard day, is that he kept showing up, through the trouble with his son, through the loneliness of those 4 evenings he wasn't at his post, through the long and unglamorous process of rebuilding a relationship with someone who had hurt him. He kept going. Not dramatically, not with any grand declaration. He just kept standing at his corner, doing his job, picking up the phone when it mattered. That steadiness, the willingness to keep going when things are unresolved, when the outcome isn't guaranteed, when there's no applause, is what I'd been missing in myself. Grief had made me endure. Desmond showed me the difference between enduring and actually continuing. I brought him coffee again last Thursday. It was raining, that particular Ottawa spring rain that is mostly just cold ambition, and he had his collar turned up and his thermos already in hand when I crossed the street. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," I said. We stood there in the rain for a few minutes talking about his daughter in Vancouver, about whether he'd actually retire next year or just keep saying he would. A bus went by. Neither of us moved toward it. Pay attention to the people around you, not because it will always be returned, not because the world keeps careful accounts, but because attention, real, consistent, unhurried attention, is the most honest thing one person can offer another. It cost me nothing to bring that first coffee. What it gave back, I'm still counting.